The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Hi, everyone, and thanks for attending our second webinar on preaching biblical texts that speak to trade. We have two excellent presenters this morning, and we'll begin with Dan Finn, who is a professor of theology and economics at the St. John's School of Theology and Seminary. Dan has written several books on economic theory and theology, the moral ecology of markets and excessive claims about markets and justice, and then in 1996 for Abboting Just Trading on the ethics and concerns of international trade. We also have with us Jim Childs, who is a prolific writer for Fortress Press and a senior research professor at Trinity Lutheran Seminary, where he was formerly the academic dean and professor of systematic theology and ethics. And we're working today, we're delving a little more deeply into Jim's work on the issue of greed, and based on his book, Economics and Ethics in Conflict. So what we'll do this morning is hear both of our presenters, and then we'll open up for questions. We also have with us Teresa Strickland, who is a marvelous homiletician, and she'll bring some reflections to us based on the presentations, and then we'll have conversation. So welcome, and let's begin. And so I'll turn everything over to Dan.
Well, good morning. This is Dan Finn. I'm here in my office in central Minnesota and trying to talk a bit about international trade and Christian morality. I think the tasks faced by preachers is a really challenging one, and I'd like to present today some ideas that might help in that challenge. And so the plan I would have for the day is that we do three things in the next 20 minutes. One, to get an idea of why economists like trade so much. A lot of people, I'm guessing, in your congregations will have heard these things, whether they're not professional economists but business people, and I think it's really helpful to understand that clearly. Secondly, to talk about one of two frameworks I'm going to propose, that there are actually four problems in economic life that every economy must solve, and that it's helpful to be aware of all four of them, even though the economic view only tends to talk about one or two. And the last piece is a framework I have called the moral ecology of markets, and basically that outlines how people think about the justice of markets, and never just of markets by themselves, but rather their moral context, or what we might call their ecology, their moral ecology. So starting with what economists think about trade, we're taken back to Adam Smith, and his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, has a longer title, as you probably know, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And Smith is given credit, even today, for the most fundamental insight into why some nations are more prosperous than others. And that has to do with what he calls the division of labor. I have to apologize to those of you for whom this is old hat, but Smith's notion was that it is the specialization that makes people more productive. And of course, for most of human history, most people were subsistence farmers and did many, many different things. We can think of farmers here on the Great Plains of the United States who had to not only grow food, but make their own soap and clothing and all kinds of other things. And Smith's argument is that much productivity comes from extra attention on only a few things and not doing so many. And he gave three reasons for this. Basically, we get better at doing something if we specialize in it. We don't lose time switching between jobs, and this was clearly a problem when you set up your soap making process. You end up having to reset up and put it back down again. Somebody who specializes in making soap all day doesn't waste that time. And most importantly, new inventions, better processes, better machinery, and so forth, helps the production. And so each of these elements of specialization, Smith argued, and economists today argue, contribute because they increase productivity. And the productivity of the average worker let's again picture the farmer on the Great Plains here in the 19th century, has two very important impacts. There's more production per hour, and so those who work in factories get higher wages, those who work on farms have higher incomes, and so those working families can afford more because they have higher income. But even more importantly is that with these lower production costs, more productive means we can produce at less cost, there will be lower prices in the marketplace, and so everybody who consumes those products will have their budget stretch farther because they'll be able to pay less for each of those products. And these two factors are what economists understand to be the reason why a nation becomes more economically prosperous, basic productivity. And that the basic reason why the United States may be more wealthy than Guatemala or other third world countries, it has to do with productivity per hour. That the carpenter here produces more of a house in an hour than a carpenter can in Guatemala, not because they work harder. In fact, often the Guatemalan has to work harder with hand tools, but gets more done per hour. So this leads then to what has famously been called creative destruction. Joseph Schumpeter, the economist that used that phrase, because less efficient producers will lose customers when more efficient producers come along, and the less efficient producers will have to find new jobs and are usually worse off, at least for a while, because they've lost their job. So we can think that when the farmers from the Midwest grew grain and sent it back to Boston, then the local farmers in western Massachusetts that used to grow wheat have to find some other job. And clearly at the beginning they're clearly worse off. So there is a kind of destruction that goes on. Consumers of course gain because there's lower prices for all this. And of course some producers gain, the more productive ones. Some lose, the ones that are less productive. And the less productive have to find another job. But they too find a job, hopefully get more productive. And this is the model, of course. And we know there are lots of problems with this today, and that's one of the reasons why the fact that people lose is one of the reasons why it's really important to have government assistance for often called trade adjustment assistance when international trade leads to the loss of jobs. But before getting to international trade, we have to think a little bit about geography in general, because geography plays an important part in this path toward greater productivity. And it was Smith himself, one of the most original insights in his book, came in this very short sentence, that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. That is, that this process of specialization that increases productivity can only increase so much depending on how large the market is. And the length, the strength, the size of the market has to do with transportation costs. And we got to think about that a little bit. The price we pay for a product includes the cost of production of that product, plus whatever it took to transport the product from the place it was made to us who use it, who buy it. And it's well known, of course, that water historically has been the cheapest way to transport things. And that's the reason why most big cities in the earlier ages grow up on waterways, on the ocean, on the mouth of a river, because it's so much cheaper to move goods along water. Obviously, the physics of it is that the friction is very low on water, and so it takes much less power to move lots and lots of weight across. And so one of the ways that England first took advantage of this was to build a series of canals. Think of the New York State Erie Canal. Dropped transportation costs, and therefore those who specialize in the production of products can have them be transported farther at a price that still can compete in the market when transportation costs fall. And so better transportation systems actually reduce prices and increase economic well-being by increasing the extent of the market, more specialization and productivity. But of course, the new areas now being reached by the more distant low-cost production will have people going out of business who used to make that product, and will have to make the adjustments we just spoke about. So this is what goes on in the national scene, and therefore the international is quite a reflection of this. Thinking about national borders, eliminating borders makes transport cheaper. Not so much physically cheaper as juridically cheaper. And so the unification of Germany and Italy were very important steps to their economic prosperity. That if we reduce border tariffs and the paperwork, that makes transport much cheaper. And of course, the problem in Germany and Italy was that every little fiefdom, every little princedom would levy its own tariff to come across there and so forth, making it more expensive to transport goods, reducing the size of markets and therefore productivity and economic well-being. So we now, of course, know that Europe with the euro has solved a lot of these problems. We can, of course, move without passport from one country to the other inside that zone. But more importantly, their products can move back and forth without having to change currencies, pass paperwork, and so forth. And, of course, we just now heard long after NAFTA, the U.S. resisted this for many years, but now Mexican trucks, just this past month, are allowed to go not only over the border, but all the way into the U.S. to make deliveries, putting, obviously, pressure on U.S. Trucking firms, but it's going to help out Mexican trucking firms who are a lower-cost option. So the point of all this, then, is that international trade is simply an extension of Adam Smith's basic insight that productivity will rise if we have larger markets, and international trade efforts generally try to reduce tariffs, reduce paperwork to make that more possible. So all that is the main reason why economists and business people think this is a good idea, not just out of self-interest, but out of the effect it has in general in the population. Now, I'd like to go on to these two frameworks for which we might have some comments here, and I'm interested in hearing your reactions to them all. The first is that there really are four problems of economic life, and markets themselves don't address them all. The first is allocation, and this is something markets do very well. Of all the resources out there that could be used for all kinds of different purposes, the process of allocation says, okay, what will they be used to make? How much of each thing will be made? What combination of resources will be used to make this and that and so forth? And markets decide these things quite efficiently because nobody has to tell the farmer, do this much wheat this year and that much oats. Nobody has to tell the steel firm how much steel to make this year compared to last year. These things are done by individuals looking at prices on the market. A lot more can be said. Distribution, who gets what of all the things that are produced? And the market does have an answer. The market says you will get whatever other people give you, and that usually comes only in return when you offer to give them something. So you offer to work for them and they pay you. You offer to sell this resource off your land, the mining ores or whatever, and they pay you something for it. The problem, of course, as we know as Christians, is that not everybody has resources to sell, and the market will not solve that problem. It has to be solved otherwise. The third is the problem of scale of the economy in the biosphere, the basic environmental problem. There's no way that the market itself will tell participants that it's now time to stop the expansion of the economy in the biosphere. Market transactions are one-to-one, and in general we tend to ignore the social costs of our in economic transactions. And the fourth is the quality of relations. Economists tend not to talk about this, but in fact it's absolutely essential for any firm to operate that people trust one another, have relationships where they cooperate and share information, and firms spend a lot of money on corporate culture to try to improve this quality of relations. And so international trade, the defense of it focuses on the allocation question and to some degree on distribution, at least in the sense that the pie gets bigger. But it ignores, in general, issues of who's not getting much at all or badly hurt in distribution, ignores the fact that this is increasing the scale of the economy in the biosphere, and depending on the nation, often ignores these issues of quality of relationships, in that the industrialized countries tend to have stronger laws for the health and safety and dignity of workers and consumers and so forth than do many other nations in the world. And trade itself does not address that. So this is a framework to think about what every economy must do, either implicitly or explicitly, and that we as Christians would insist that these things must be addressed explicitly. And trade proponents often don't do that. The second general framework I was going to propose is I've been calling the moral ecology of markets. And that is that if we want to look at the justice of markets, and that's true whether we're talking about people on the far left, Marxists, to the far right, libertarians, everybody has a view of justice of the markets. And I would claim that they all address the same four areas, even though they come up with different answers. So the first piece, of course, is what are the rules for markets? And markets need rules, need a structure. And the market itself cannot provide this, of course. They're provided by government. And so this is not a question of governments intervening in markets, as free marketers sometimes say. It's governments defining markets, saying this activity is going to be legal, this one is not going to be legal. This one over here, we don't like it, but we may leave it legal in order to respect freedom or whatever else. But this over here is abusive enough that we're going to make it illegal. And people on the right have a very short list of the rules they want. People on the left have a much longer list. But there were markets even in the old Soviet Union. They were much more restricted, and people, when they earned their rubles, could still go to the store to spend them, but what the store had was also determined by a central decision. So everybody wants markets, and nobody wants literally free markets. The question is, what should the rules be? Secondly, everybody expects that essential goods and services must be provided to everyone. The difference is that some folks have a very short list, others a very long list of what's essential. So even libertarians don't think you'd have a just society unless the services of the police and the courts are provided to everyone. Even the poor fellow who cannot afford to pay any taxes deserves police protection in a libertarian state. Everybody else, farther left, has a longer list. Republicans add extra things. Democrats add more things they think are essential, and the Soviet Union included lots more things. So the debate is not should there be provided these things. No, the debate is what is so essential that it must be provided. Third, the morality of persons and organizations. Everybody insists on this. There are different readings of what that should be, how that should go, what should be the way to think about that. But everybody left to right has this view of that. Even Mao Zedong said we've got to have certain levels of morality and trust within our cadre and others when we're confronting the capitalists and so forth. But everybody needs that. And lastly, civil society, this panoply of organizations from larger than the family and smaller than the government, from parent-teachers organizations to the Chamber of Commerce and labor unions and all sorts of service organizations. A vibrant civil society is really important, even though people on the right tend to interpret them as simply ways for individuals to accomplish the goals they have. And people farther to the middle and the left think not only is it to accomplish one's goals, but the very fact that we work together, the cooperative nature, the community, is itself important to us. Now, I think from a Christian point of view, there are perspectives we can take from our tradition and clearly from the Bible, as Attlee talked about very well the last time, for all of these issues. And the task, I suppose, of preachers in talking about economic life and trade has to say, okay, what does our Christian biblical tradition say about these various elements? How do we work that out? So this framework will not answer that question, but it reminds everybody from right to left that these are, I would say, the four issues that have to be debated among ourselves. And the agenda is, okay, how do we think these things through? So finally, I think it's the fundamental assumption of this webinar, and clearly more broadly in life, is that choice in economic life always has to include an empirical judgment and a moral judgment. The empirical judgment is, okay, if we do this, what's actually going to happen? And well-intentioned efforts to improve the world that are naive empirically aren't a very good idea, even from a moral point of view. On the other hand, there's a moral judgment. One can't just say that this will be the effect and therefore make a decision without having a moral judgment implicit in there. And it seems to me, the preacher's expertise in the question of the moral judgment, where we bring to bear what this biblical tradition has said about these issues. But we have to be attuned enough to those whose empirical work, which they do professionally, sociologists and economists and others, can be brought to bear on these very same arguments, even if that doesn't become a large part of anybody's sermon. And awareness of that becomes key. So what I've tried to do here then is to give a brief outline of what economists think about trade, why they think it's a great idea and good for most people most of the time. These four problems of economic life that every economy has to solve, whether they do it badly or well, implicitly or not. And then this moral ecology of markets, the four issues that everybody who has a view of the justice or injustice of markets takes a view on each of these four issues, and those are the issues on which I believe our Christian tradition has much to tell us. So I look forward to Jim's comments and to a conversation later. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And now we'll turn to Jim for some mining of his theories about greed and a theological look at it.
Okay, welcome. Show my screen. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for a really edifying presentation, Dan. Toward a Sharing Global Society is the title, a theological context for the impact of trade policy on hunger and poverty. I want to just say a few words about that screen. First of all, what I will be trying to do is place the issues of trade and its impact on hunger and poverty in what is a more general ethical and theological context without the kind of specific expertise that Dan is able to bring to it, and with a particular focus on hunger as a kind of paradigm case. I like the word sharing because it communicates, at least to me, the relational feel, the notion that we are a community of humankind and related to one another inextricably, and that sharing, rather than a more abstract concept such as distributive justice or the like, conveys not only a biblical notion but the kind of relational reality of our human community that is very deeply rooted in biblical anthropology as well. As Alexis said earlier, I'm taking my cues from a book I wrote earlier called Greed, Economics and Ethics in Conflict. The subtitle should really be Economics and Ethics in Dialogue, but publishers think conflict sells better than dialogue, so that's how the title came out. And so with that in mind, we'll move along. In this analysis, I spoke of our own American cultural heritage and talked about two very deep cultural impulses: the belief in limitlessness, the fact that there is always more beyond the horizon, that the limits of growth are unlimited, and a belief in maximum freedom, that our freedom to achieve and attain that which we wish should not be curtailed or limited in any way, any more than is absolutely necessary, and that goes both for individuals and for groups. Well, if you put the two notions together, there is limitlessness, and we should maximize freedom. We have the seedbed of greed, which is to say, if there's always more, and if freedom is something we shouldn't restrict unnecessarily, then for me to have or for my group to have all that we want is not going to deny anybody else. So that we have then a kind of foundation for the possibility of greed. Now, greed is not only an individual vice. Communities, professions, nations, they can all qualify in a quest for inordinate gain and control and power. For example, medical science is always wanting more research and more technological development and so forth, without asking the question, does this channeling of resources in that particular direction somehow take away from general needs of health care throughout the entire population? But with the two impulses of limitlessness and freedom in place, the conclusion that is drawn is that the acquisition and possession of the world's goods is not a zero-sum game, so that for one group or one individual to have more does not mean that someone else or some other group has less. But at the same time, we experience that things are out of whack. In this book on greed, I was trying to avoid characterizing any particular philosophical or economic or political position by just simply using the technical term, things are out of whack. And by that, I refer to the disparities that we all experience locally and that we are aware of globally, which make it clear that, as in the pictures that we looked at as children, what's wrong with this picture? And so we witness in often painful ways the great disparities of people who are terribly disadvantaged on the one hand and those who have an affluent life on the other hand. But the argument, as I suggested in the previous slide, is for limited growth is a very hard one to win, even though environmentalists keep telling us about the limits of resources, and many people throughout the world are experiencing severe limitations on their possibilities. But nonetheless, despite all of that, no one wants to say that, or many do not wish to say, I should correct myself, that we are involved in a zero-sum game. But regardless of how that argument is carried forward, for Christians, I would argue that the limits to freedom and gain are set by the needs of the neighbor. And that is basically the principle with which I want to move forward. Now, in terms of unshared goods, we might cite many, but I'm choosing to talk a little bit about hunger as a rather dramatic case of unshared goods. We know that there is plenty of food, but there is difficulty in its distribution, and a key focal point for concerns about trade policy is the reality of hunger. Now, there are examples of policies that impact developing nations' economies, and I have just chosen a few from my own reading. Higher tariffs on processed agricultural goods disadvantage less developed nations because, of course, there is greater profit in the selling of processed goods than there is in the selling of raw materials or basic agricultural products. And so there is a disadvantage experienced in that regard. Subsidies to U.S. farmers that keep prices low and make competition difficult is another one that is often cited. And it's my understanding, and maybe incorrect about this, but that these subsidies originally were developed to help family farms continue and flourish. But as agriculture has become agribusiness, the subsidies are not serving their original purpose and are at least open to discussion. I would then direct your attention to the Bread for the World 2011 Hunger Report and search out the sections on trade. It's a searchable document. I like the Bread for the World Institute Hunger Report because it is not ideologically driven. It does not demonize, and it is very thoroughly researched. It recognizes, for example, that there are significant benefits of international trade for many countries, and at the same time recognizes those areas where it argues for some change in policy or some adjustment in practice that would be more just and beneficial to a broader international public. So the Bread for the World Institute Hunger Report is one that I would recommend. In an earlier edition of the Bread for the World Report, they listed 10 ways to promote a better world for hungry people. And there, I won't list them all, but here are just a few to illustrate. Complement markets with government and civic action to ensure secure livelihoods for all. Include hungry and poor people in the decisions that affect their lives. Coordinate policies among nations to foster full employment and other social goals. Promote international trade with safeguards for labor rights, the environment, and food security. And foster food security through more liberal agricultural trade coupled with sound agricultural policies and safety nets. So you get the flavor of these recommendations as being comprehensive and carefully thought out. And so once again, I would recommend that you find this site and see what can be learned from it. So toward a sharing global society, there are New Testament foundations which help to place a biblical frame around the issues of trade, of poverty, of hunger. We have, of course, the parable of the rich fool who had this tremendous harvest and decided that he would build new and bigger barns so as to keep all his harvest to himself. And what's at stake here, in the biblical world of Palestine in the New Testament era, the vision was, unlike our own, where we think of limitlessness, the vision was of a limited goods society. There was only so much wealth, only so much power, only so much honor to go around. So that if any one individual or group had more than others, then others automatically had less. And this lies behind the condemnation of the rich fool of Luke 12, that he did not share, but rather in storing his stuff, not only kept it to himself, but made it certain that when hard times came, others would have to buy from him, which might be a good business plan, but in that particular world, the failure to share brought the condemnation that we read. Paul's admonitions and praise for generosity and sharing are also helpful points of contact in the scriptures. First, the Romans 15 passage, where Paul is commenting on the collections taken in the churches of Macedonia and Achaia for the needy in Jerusalem. He says, Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to share their resources with the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. They were pleased to do this, and indeed they owe it to them, for it is the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings. They ought also to be of service to them in material ways. Now the Greek word koinonikos, to share, is from koinonia, community or communion, sometimes translated fellowship. Sharing is constitutive of community, and community is constitutive of sharing. They go together, and they remind us of the communal images that constitute our understanding of the church and of life together in the body of Christ as a witness to the larger community of humanity in the world. Then just to read for a moment from 1 Timothy, where Paul says, "For those who in the present are rich, command them not to be haughty or set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but rather on God who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, generous and ready to share, thus storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of the life that really is life." Well, in the New Testament, whether we're talking of the rich fool or Paul's thoughts on the matter, wealth is not in and of itself to be demonized, but rather the use of wealth in sharing in sense of community with others, which of course is a good corollary of neighbor love. Well, sharing in capitalism may seem to be restricted particularly to top management, but there is an alternative, and that is stakeholder capitalism. What is it and how does it work? Well, the idea is that the purpose of corporations or businesses is not simply to produce a bottom line profit for its investors, but rather the bottom line profit is instrumental. That is, it needs to happen, but its purpose is not in itself. Its purpose is to serve the values of all stakeholders. So, workers, investors, the community in which businesses are located, the environment in many instances, the government, and so forth. This variety of stakeholders which depend upon the values potentially produced by that business become the focus and purpose of the enterprise rather than just the return on investment. Well, this may seem naive in the face of competitive capitalism to even talk about, and yet there are some business leaders today who do discuss this. And there is the potential, it seems to me, of a model here, at least conceptually, for thinking about business in a world of globalization. And I would refer you to the website of the Co-Principles, the Co-Roundtable of Business Leaders, and there is a quote there on the screen. The Co-Roundtable started in 1994, in which a number of impressive business leaders of an international business developed principles which they believed would promote the idea that business has a responsibility to the well-being of the global community, that business has a responsibility to the welfare of the communities it operates in. It needs to be concerned with all stakeholders, not just shareholders. Orienting effects of business toward innovation, justice, and world community takes into account the extraordinary power and influence of global business, and that goes with it to be a force for good. And so, in thoughts along this line, the co-principles seem to embody a notion of stakeholder capitalism on a global scale. Well, finally, if we are preaching on issues of fair trade, poverty, hunger, issues of justice, the clear information about the issues, of course, is essential. But that which will motivate people to action and to become involved and concerned, I believe, is always going to be, that motivation is always going to be from the gospel. And that gospel involves seeing revealed in the Christ event the future of God's reign, the future of the world in which there is fullness of life, wholeness, peace, justice, freedom, communion and union with God and each other. And so as we seek in whatever manner possible these values for our neighbors in this world, we run ahead to meet them as they come to us from God's future. And the Eucharistic foretaste of the feast to come, then, includes a call to work for the end of hunger, that having food to eat, others might enter into our hope. In effect, then, it is the gospel that inspires us and empowers us and gives us hope that however difficult and complex these efforts are, we still have a vocation to pursue them. And in our proclamation from the pulpit and elsewhere, it is that gospel promise and hope that we take strength from and remind ourselves that we have that capacity by grace. So, with those thoughts, I conclude.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, both Jim and Dan. Do we have questions? Are there folks who would like to put some questions? Here. Okay.
Sorry, there was a little.
This morning.
There was a little technical difficulty. I tried to unmute all of the participants, but then it really messed up the sound. So if you're a participant and if you have a question, you can raise your hand, or and I will unmute you, or you can type a question in.
Okay. Why don't we turn to Teresa Strickland? Teresa is...
She's no longer online, so I think she was having some computer problems.
Uh-oh. Because I'm looking at a note here that says she has a PowerPoint too.
Yeah. I see that.
Yeah. Well,
Maybe if any of the presenters have any comments.
yeah.
Well, I'm very appreciative for what Jim has shared with us here today, and this overstatement of the limitlessness of life that is characteristic of sort of the economic view of things, but also of popular culture. How many ads on television tell us there are no limits and all the rest of that is just a very fundamental part of the Christian understanding of economic life from my perspective, that we need to be aware that, in fact, the limits, not only are there limits, but the limits are for our own good as individuals and as a society. And especially that ties in then with to the view of profits that I like to have, the way Jim put it, that profit has a purpose beyond itself. I'm reminded of hearing one CEO say once that for him, the profits of his firm are like eating is to an individual person. That is to say, it's essential, but that's not the whole point. You know, it allows the firm to do things that need to be done, both internally and externally. But one doesn't evaluate the firm based on whether it's made a profit or not. Essential, but only instrumental.
Yeah, and I appreciate. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Jim.
No, I appreciate Dan's laying out some of the basic stuff of economic life and trade, because we need to know how these things work before we can think about anything like an adjustment or a reform if that is called for. And I think most of us don't fully appreciate the complexity and the history of the development of economic theory and so on. So I think having it laid out in this fashion enables us to pinpoint those points at which we enter the discussion out of Christian concern. And I think the ecology, I believe, part of the presentation was very helpful in that respect, and the questions that always get asked. That kind of education can help us frame our conversation about these things without becoming, driven by ideological fervor that demonizes everything.
Teresa Strickland is back online,
Good.
so I'm going to go ahead and make her the presenter.
Can you?
Hello?
Hear you, and I can't.
Yeah, we hear you fine.
I don't know if I'm being heard.
You're being heard.
Okay.
Okay?
I'm going to go on and pretend that you can hear me, though I cannot always. I think one of the things that we have to think about as preachers is take what can be a very complex issue
Teresa, I think we're having a technical difficulty.
Very
I think we're having a technical difficulty with her microphone, so. Alexa?
Yeah, I'm wondering, Teresa, I don't know if she can hear us. Teresa, are you still?
She's no longer online.
She's no longer online. Okay. All right. The Theology and Worship Unit is in at a retreat center this week in southern Indiana, so she's off-site, and I'm not quite sure what's transpired. Could we open for other comment that other folks may have? Okay. Well, let me remind people that we're going to gather again on November the 30th. It'll be the same time, 10 a.m. Eastern or daylight savings time now. And it will be specifically a preaching conversation led by Teresa, and some of our other presenters will be available as well. So I'm very grateful for your time and effort, and we'll talk again on the 30th. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.